Hey, it's Callum Bose here. I've seen a lot of people create make scenarios that have a webhook trigger to use with their Knack app, and a lot of them have a pretty serious security issue. So today I'm going to demonstrate that security issue and show you how to fix it. If you found this video helpful, remember to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel so you get notified about any new videos I post. I also offer development and coaching and maintenance of Knack apps, so if you need help with a project, get in touch with me at enliven-it.com.au, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Okay, so let's have a look at the security issue first. A little bit of background. I have a Knack app, very simple, with two tables. A table called deletion requests, which just has a date time field, and a table called history, which is just a bunch of records with names. They don't really mean anything, it's just to illustrate a point. I also have a table called accounts, which is my user roles table. So I have user roles enabled, and I have admin and staff user roles. I have a few users already in my app. Some are admins, some are staff, some have no role. And I have a couple of simple pages. I have a public homepage with nothing on it, a staff page for staff to use with nothing on it as well. And then I have an admin page that only admins can log into, and that has a form on it. It's an empty form that creates a new deletion request record, and I've labeled the submit button delete history records via make webhook. In my code, I have a function that basically triggers a make webhook, so it sends a request to a make custom webhook trigger, and I've set on submit of view 4, which is that admin form that we just looked at, trigger that webhook, and I've got a webhook URL in here. Then I have a make workflow, which has that custom webhook trigger, which corresponds with the URL here. And when it's triggered, it searches for all the history records in Knack. So in this case, we've got just these 3 history records. And then it loops through and deletes all the records that it finds. So we've created basically a very simple kind of pointless make workflow that deletes a bunch of data when one of our admin users clicks the button. So let's go have a look at that in action. So I'm going to just start my make workflow, and I'm going to click this button which has the code associated with it, which triggers that webhook. So I'm going to click that, and then my make workflow starts running, and then it's going to delete 3 records, and it's done. Now if I go to my history table, there's no records anymore. So that's the intended functionality. Admins can, when they're logged in, they can click a button that deletes a bunch of records due to the make integration that we've made. So no problems there so far, but that's the setup that we have. Okay, so now I've added some history records back, and I am going to demonstrate the security issue with this setup. So obviously we don't want members of the public or people with different user roles to trigger that deletion. So you might be thinking, well, they can't, of course, because this page is only accessible to admins. And that is true, but you've got to remember that any code that we write in the Knack JavaScript area is readable pretty easily by someone. And I'm going to show that now. So if I open a new incognito window, which means I'm not logged in, and load any page of my Knack app, without being logged in, I can go right click, inspect, sources, and open up one of these here. And here on the right hand side, I can read my JavaScript code. So then if I copy that URL and enable my make scenario again, and from completely outside my Knack app, I'm going to just visit that URL in my browser. And there we go, our scenario has been triggered. So because our Knack JavaScript area code is publicly accessible, anyone who knows about your Knack app in some way can easily read it, which is why we never put things like the API key in there. But because this webhook doesn't have any way to tell that a logged in Knack user has made that request or whether it was just someone random with the URL, we've got this glaring security issue. So yeah, not good. Okay, so now we're going to look at how to fix that. It's going to be helpful just to have a look at this diagram to understand in a different way what just happened. And then we're going to look at our updated version and how it's going to be different. So we have a user logging in, they submitted the form, which triggers the Knack JavaScript code, which sends a request to the webhook URL. Make receives that webhook URL, and then it does stuff. So that's our intended workflow, no problems. But if someone discovers your webhook URL in the current setup, they can send a request to it from completely outside of Knack, even if they're not logged in or not even a user of your app. Make will receive the webhook trigger and run anyway because we haven't added any logic to prevent that, basically. We haven't added any logic to validate that the requester was a Knack user rather than someone random. So we're going to fix it by modifying our make workflow just a little bit and also our Knack code. So when we make the request from Knack, so the user submits the form, our JavaScript code runs to trigger the webhook. We're going to include a little bit more data, the logged in users token, which is like some information about the logged in user to your app. That will allow us to modify our make workflow a little bit to check that token and make sure that it corresponds with a valid logged in user to your app and only continue if that succeeds. That means your valid logged in Knack user will make it all the way through and cool things will still run. See our little happy Knack symbol there? But our hacker who isn't a logged in user to your app will get blocked here. So the webhook will begin, make will check if there's any credentials. It won't find valid credentials and therefore it will not continue. So we've got our little crossed out hacker there to show that. So let's get going and make that happen. So the first thing that we'll do is add our user token when we make the request to then make webhook trigger. So instead of my original function, which just basically sends a request to the particular URL, we're going to use a slightly different helper function. So I'm going to get rid of that one. And we're going to go trigger webhook with user token instead. So on the submit of that particular form, trigger the webhook with the user token. Still, we just provide the URL of our webhook trigger in make, and it just runs. But in the actual helper function, you can see that we're adding some headers here. And so what that means is a little bit of extra data sent along with the request, and we're saying knack.getUserToken, which basically is a method that Knack provides to get the credentials of the logged in user if there is a logged in user. So I'm going to save that, and the code for that will be available in the description as well. So then I'm going to refresh, and now before we run it, let's just have a look. We have basically no data arriving for our webhook at the moment. We're going to modify one thing in here. We're going to go show advanced settings. Actually, sorry, we're going to go edit of our actual webhook, and we're going to go show advanced settings, and we're going to say get request headers yes, and that will mean that some of that data is available when we send it. And I'm going to enable that again and refresh my front end. I've already saved my code, and we'll see what we get back now. So click the button, I'm logged in admin. Of course, nothing changes, it still runs. We didn't have any records, that's why it errored. We didn't have any records to delete, but the rest of it ran anyway. And I get these headers now. One of these is a user token, and here it is here. So the user token that we provided in our code when we triggered the webhook is now available to make, and here's the credentials, which is not really readable, but we can send those to Knack servers to validate whether there's a logged in user. So that's step one. But of course, we're not doing anything with that yet. So in the next section of the video, we're going to actually work out how to use that token, which doesn't really mean anything to us right now, to safely determine if a user was actually logged in and is valid. So now we need to add logic that takes that user token from Knack, checks it, and determines if the user is valid. And to do that, we're actually going to create a second workflow. And because this logic can become reusable for any of your make scenarios, we could do this all in one workflow, but then we're going to be rebuilding the same logic over and over and over again. And there's a bit there, so it's better to do it as a separate one. So I have a blueprint already created, and I'm going to include a link to that in the video description. So download the blueprint from the link, and then we're going to go import. I'll pause the video while I go find that file. So I clicked import. I'm going to go choose file, and here is my blueprints that I'm going to include the links to in the video. I'm going to do validate Knack session, and I'm going to go save. And then I get a pre-built workflow. So let's have a look at what's actually happening in this workflow. And we also need to adjust two things in here. So the trigger is a webhook. And because we've just imported a blueprint, we don't actually have a webhook yet. So we're going to create one. And we're going to say validate Knack session. We're going to show advanced settings, and we're going to say get request headers as well. And we're going to hit save. And then okay. We'll test that out in a sec. So we have a webhook, which our other scenario is going to call. Then from the headers of that we sent from our other scenario, which we're going to see in a second, we are extracting the user token from there. So this is a function here that just extracts the particular header of all the headers that we have and finds the value that we need, which is our user token. And we save that to a variable. Now we need to adjust this as well. This actually sends a request to Knack servers saying for your particular application, and we need to insert our application ID here, is this token that we've provided a valid user? Well, it's not quite saying that. It's actually saying send us some more information about this user if it's a valid user. And then we're going to use some more logic over here to test that. So it's basically getting the session, getting information about the logged in user. And we're not trusting what the user sent us. We're validating that by going and asking Knack for that data based on the token. So I need to input my application ID into there where it says insert your application ID here, so it knows which app to fetch data about. Okay, so yeah, we've sent some information to this scenario. We've extracted the user token. Now we've asked Knack to send us information about that user if it's a valid user. And then we run some logic. So if the user is authorized, that one of these two will run, and otherwise it'll be not authorized and we'll send back a different response. So we can use this in our workflow to determine whether the user is authorized. Okay, so this one has some filters. If the data we got back from Knack, the user status is current, so that means the actual login session is still valid, it hasn't expired. The user account status corresponds with the user status here, so the user has to be active, not pending or inactive. The approval status has to be approved. I'm not entirely sure how that comes into play, but it's a good idea to have it there anyway. And then we can optionally, when we call this, specify that it has to be a certain user role that has this, and I'll go into more detail about that soon. So these are an option. If we have specified a particular user role, it's going to check all that and to determine whether the user role is the correct one. This one, is the same, but it doesn't care about which user role. It just has to be any logged in user, not a logged in admin or logged in staff member. And then this is the fallback one that doesn't meet any of these two criteria and it's not authorized. That's the nitty gritty. In short, when this runs, you can call this from another scenario and it will determine if your logged in user is valid or not. So if your credentials correspond to a logged in user. Okay, so we've adjusted the webhook, we've adjusted the Knack session. Now we need to save our scenario and we need to enable it. And we need to copy our webhook URL and paste that somewhere to use later. Now we need to adjust our original scenario to call our session validation scenario. Now to make that easier, I've created one more blueprint. So I'm going to go import blueprint, choose file, and I'm going to say use this one, validated webhook trigger with Knack starter. So you probably don't want to do that on a scenario that you've already built because it will replace your entire scenario. But you can import it to a blank scenario, which I've just done, and just copy the setup. Or if you're starting a new scenario, you can import it as your starting point. In our case, we're going to copy this logic over. So this is our imported one. This is the scenario we're actually trying to build out with the deletions. So webhook trigger, we don't need to do anything with in this case when we're just copying. If not, we would actually create a webhook here. Then we're going to create a HTTP make a request module, and we're going to paste in the correct webhook URL, which would usually come in looking like that when you import it. And we're going to set it up like this. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to add a module to our workflow. We're going to go HTTP make a request. Now we need the URL of our other webhook that we copied earlier. So copy address to clipboard. That's the one, the validate Knack session separate workflow that we created just before. We're going to go post and add the headers. So the headers are the ones that we have from our trigger step. I didn't quite do that right, actually. So I need to actually set it to a dynamic value of the headers. Then we're going to go OK. And then this is our last thing, which is a filter step. So we want to go status code equal to whatever and only continue if it's 200, which means it was successful. So our other session, if it's unsuccessful, will return a 500 code, which means an error. But the successfully authorized ones all both return 200, which is just these things that computers use on the internet to know whether like a request to somewhere was successful or involved some sort of error. So we're making use of those for easy kind of filtering here. So we need to add a filter after our request there. We're going to call it only continue if authorized. And status code is equal to 200. And this one we should rename to check if logged in Knack user. Okay, so summing up what I just did, you can import the blueprint to get a feel for how to set it up, or you can copy that logic to your existing one, or you can use this as a starter. And I have basically added as my first step a request to my validate Knack session workflow, and I've passed in the info needs to know if a logged in Knack user is present, and it will return back either a successful 200 request, which means the request is successful and we do have a authorized user, or it will return some other number, 500 specifically, which means some error occurred and we don't have a valid logged in Knack user. And we're only continuing if we get the success message from the other workflow. It's all very theoretical. Let's give it a go. So I'm going to save and I'm going to run once on both of them just so we can see the progress as it goes. Okay, so back to my form. Triggering that triggers my first webhook. And in this case, we did continue past the filter. We errored here because we didn't have any records to delete again. So let's go and have a look at what happened in this one. We received data including our headers, and one of these is our user token. There it is. Because this received the headers, we forwarded the headers on to our validate session, so this received the headers, and then we extracted the user token from there, and then we got back some data from Knack, and the data we got was a session. So you can see that here we've got a whole lot of information about the logged in user, including what user roles they have, whether their account is active, all of that sort of stuff. And we can trust that data because it came directly from Knack. And then our logic ran. So in this case, we said a session, the session was active, it was current, the user status is active, the user status is approved, and there was no detail about specific user roles. So this one succeeded, and so we sent back this authorized 200 response, which means everything went well and it's a logged in user. So that ran all the way through, and then we got that response back here. We determined that we did have an authorized user based on the response, and then we continued. So let's go and look at what would happen if we did the hack like we did before. Would it run? So I've gone and found my URL as if I'm a hacker. I'm going to open a new incognito window, send a request. Now let's go see what happens. Of course, I forgot to run them, didn't I? Okay, so let me turn those on and I'll try again. Send the request again. Okay, so we did not continue. So our hacker can no longer willy-nilly run our scenario because they didn't send any credentials. So what happened in our main workflow is we received information. In here, we didn't have anything to do with user token. But anyway, we forwarded the headers on to our special validate Knack session workflow. This received all that. It pulled out no user token. Therefore, Knack wasn't able to send back a valid session. We didn't get anything useful from Knack. And therefore, the two options of the user being authorized didn't run, and we went back to our fallback, which means the user is not authorized. We sent back a 500, which is an error message, and therefore this received 500 back, and therefore when this ran, it didn't find the success message, and so the whole thing stopped. So we've successfully done this. We've allowed the hacker to send the request, but because there was no credentials, Make says no, we're not going to continue because we don't have a valid not logged in Knack user. Now, what if we want to make sure that only admins or only staff members can trigger that workflow? So we're going to have a look at the admin user role table, and we can see object 3 is what that table is called in the URL up here. We're going to make note of that. So when we call the check if logged in Knack user kind of workflow, we have the option to pass in a little bit of extra data to limit it, so it will only tell us that it's authorized if the logged in user has that particular role. So we're going to go add query string, and we're going to say allowed profile, and we're going to paste in object 3 here. Now we need to make one change because Knack actually stores profiles as like those. Knack returns back profile 3 in place of object 3 when we validate. So if it says object 3, we need to say profile 3, which means the same thing basically. It needs to be a admin for this to pass the user validation. So what this is saying is that we're going to be asking to check if the credentials we've sent are a valid logged in Knack user that has the user role of admin at least. It could have more roles, but it has to have the user role of admin. So let's turn on our scenarios again, see if that works. So I am a logged in admin. So I should expect that this works. Here it goes. We did continue, and therefore we continued and we errored here again, once again, because we don't have records to delete. Let's go look at what happened in here. Everything as before, but we also got this parameter allowed profile. Everything that happened through here is the same, but we see that this particular route ran instead. So the filters there, if we open them up, says it looks for the existence of allowed profile from the trigger step. And if it finds it, then it will check that the data from Knack contains the allowed profile. So it checked to make sure the profile of the logged in user from Knack, so data session user profile keys, it needed to make sure that profile 3 existed in there, otherwise it would have failed. So let's make sure that it would fail. So we're going to turn them on again, and this time we're going to say that the logged in user has to have the staff member profile object 4 or profile 4. So I actually have to turn that one off and modify my setup. So now I'm saying make sure the person who requested this is a logged in staff member. Now the logged in person is only an admin. The logged in person is called admin only, and their only user role is admin, so we should expect that this fails. So let's give it a go. And there we go, it failed. So in this case, neither of the valid paths ran, and so we went back to the not authorized, which stopped this running completely. And the same would happen if we ran it as a public user again, of course. So that is basically another version of this, but we get to be a bit more specific about who this is. Instead of checking that it's a logged in Knack user that triggered it, we're checking that it's a logged in Knack user with the user role of admin or with the user role of staff member, and only then continue. So we're actually able to protect our make scenario, not only logged in user or not, but actually by user role. Whew, that was a big one. So now you know how to protect a make workflow if you use a custom webhook trigger. I'm going to share the code for the Knack JavaScript area as well as the blueprints for the make scenarios in the comments of this video. Let me know if you give it a try. Comment with any questions. I can make a follow-up video or whatever. Let me know how you go. Thanks.